A small town on the east coast of America, on the brink of autumn, welcomed James with warm winds and just a hint of yellow on the maples. He had come back to his hometown, Ashland, after a long absence, nearly 20 years since he left to pursue education and build a career. In that time, he became a successful professional and started a family. But now, following a recent divorce and a search for peace, James returned to his roots, deciding to temporarily settle in the family home. His teenage daughter, Emily, had come with him, a headstrong, determined young girl, just like her father at that age. The recent divorce was still fresh, and she was struggling to adjust to her new life. She longed to return to the big city, where her friends and familiar surroundings were. Emily showed little interest in her father's past or in this small, boring town that, in her eyes, didn't even have a proper movie theater. James understood that moving had been tough for her, but he hoped she might learn to appreciate the simpler things here and the kinds of connections that aren't easily broken. The first family dinner felt steeped in nostalgia. James' mother, always cheerful and hospitable, shared funny stories about neighbors and friends from his childhood. Emily's grandmother, Mrs. Banks, had kept the house like a museum, with the same old photos on the walls and the wooden swing on the porch. Emily listened, but her mind was clearly back in the big city and its lively pace. The next morning, James was surprised by how quickly news spread around Ashland. It seemed that everyone already knew he was back, and soon old friends started showing up at his door, friends with whom he had shared high school years and youthful dreams. One of them, Katie, had once been his best friend and first love. They'd lost touch over the years, but Katie looked almost the same as she had in high school, only wiser and more assured. She greeted him with a warm, slightly teasing look. "Jamie, and here you are again," she said, barely hiding a smile. "It's been so long that I almost thought you'd forgotten us all." "To be honest, I hardly recognize myself," he replied. "Didn't you ever feel the urge to leave?" Katie smiled, shaking her head. "No, I love this town, strange as it sounds. Here, things are just as they should be. Maybe because here it's easy to just be yourself." They talked about the past and how they had each tried to stay true to their childhood dreams, even though life had often turned out differently than they imagined. James couldn't help but notice that Katie had remained just as genuine and open-hearted despite the challenges time had thrown at her. That evening, Emily grew restless and kept wanting to go out. Her grandmother suggested they go to an old cafe near the town square, run by their distant relative Mrs. Joyce. James gladly agreed. Sitting at the wooden table, he remembered all the hours he'd spent in this very cafe with his friends from high school, all their conversations about what the future might hold. Emily, however, was unmoved. She tried scrolling on her phone, but the weak signal only frustrated her more. James watched her, understanding how hard it was for her to get used to the new place and new surroundings. He knew that one reason for her irritation was her mother's choice not to come back to Ashland. The next day, James decided to show Emily the town and her new school. Unlike him at her age, Emily was reserved and preferred to keep her distance, avoiding making new friends. But James knew this couldn't last forever. He took her to an old alley where the local teens gathered in the evenings. There he ran into a few old acquaintances, who of course already knew he was back. Among them was Katie, who had brought her own son, a few years younger than Emily. James and Katie started chatting, and to his surprise, Emily looked more engaged than usual and even interacted with some of the other teens. It seemed to lift her mood a bit, and James felt reassured that coming here had been a good decision. That evening, Katie invited them over for dinner to reminisce and introduce Emily to the local youth. Over dinner, they talked about their high school years and about young love, and how Katie had always been honest and direct. Her son, noticing how animated his mother was with James, joined in the conversation too, bringing smiles to everyone's faces. As they walked home, Emily remarked that her dad seemed more than happy to see Katie again. James realized he was becoming a part of this place once more, as if he had never really left. Settling into Ashland turned out to be more challenging for Emily than James had expected. While she spent her days trudging through the routines of a small-town high school, he spent his mornings working remotely from his parents' living room, attempting to keep up his city lifestyle in an entirely different setting. Despite the slow pace, though, he was beginning to feel the deep calm that Ashland had always given him, something he hadn't felt for years. Emily, on the other hand, was growing increasingly frustrated. Used to the vibrancy of a bustling city, she found Ashland stifling. No familiar cafes, no shopping centers, no thrilling after-school activities, just a quaint, quiet town that moved at a snail's pace compared to the life she'd known. James realized that he would need to be more proactive if he wanted Emily to feel any sort of connection to the place that had once been his entire world. One afternoon, after finishing a work meeting, James suggested they go to a community fair being held in the town square. Emily was less than enthusiastic, but seeing her father's excitement, she reluctantly agreed. When they arrived, the square was packed with booths of local artisans, carnival games, and familiar faces from his high school days. For James, this was more than a fair, it was a reunion with people who had witnessed his youth. For Emily, though, it was just another small-town event, the kind she usually avoided. Then, as they wandered through the booths, a familiar voice called out, "Hey, Jamie, fancy seeing you here." Turning around, James saw Katie, her face lit up in a warm smile, carrying a basket full of homemade candles from her own booth. She offered one to Emily with a playful grin. These might not be as exciting as the malls in the city, but Ashland fairs are famous for their charm. Give it a chance, Em. Emily took the candle reluctantly, but managed a polite smile. Katie could see the reluctance in her eyes and exchanged a quick glance with James. "You know, I once felt trapped here too," Katie told Emily. "It's like the world has shrunk, right? But one day, I realized that maybe there's something to be found in a place that knows how to stand still." They continued walking together, with Katie joining them as they moved from booth to booth. At first, Emily drifted behind them, half-heartedly listening to their conversation. But after a while, she seemed to soften a bit, amused by their stories of high school pranks and childhood mischief. She didn't fully participate, but her smile hinted at a curiosity about her dad's past life, even if she wouldn't admit it. As the fair went on, they met more of James's former classmates, each one sharing stories of their lives since high school. James was struck by how many people had stayed in Ashland. Some ran small businesses, others were teachers, and a few had taken over family farms. Despite the different paths they had taken, each had somehow found a way to build a fulfilling life in Ashland. "Why didn't you stay, Dad?" Emily asked unexpectedly, breaking a quiet moment as they walked back to the car. James paused, caught off guard by her question. "I guess I wanted more back then," he admitted. "I thought a small town was too simple, that I needed to explore the world to be happy. But as you get older, sometimes you realize that what seemed boring can actually be peaceful. And that can be worth a lot." Emily didn't respond but seemed to be considering his answer. That evening, as they ate dinner at home, Mrs. Banks joined them, eagerly recounting stories about James as a child. It was a rare moment when the three generations of their family were able to laugh together, sharing memories and stories that, perhaps for the first time, felt real to Emily. Over the following days, James began taking Emily on small outings, like hikes in the forest trails he had loved as a kid and trips to the lake where he'd spent countless summers. Slowly, Emily began to let her guard down. She still missed her friends and the city, but there was something about Ashland. Its quiet, its routines, the friendliness of everyone they met, that was beginning to grow on her. It was as if the town was weaving its way into her, despite her best efforts to resist it. One evening, Katie invited them over for dinner. Her son, Sam, was eager to get to know Emily, and as they settled into Katie's cozy living room, the two teens found themselves exchanging stories about school, friends, and hobbies. To everyone's surprise, Emily and Sam shared a lot in common, and for the first time since moving to Ashland, James saw his daughter genuinely laughing, her usual guard lowered. As the adults chatted, Katie asked James, "How's Emily adjusting?" "She's getting there," James replied with a small smile. "I think she's beginning to feel a bit more at home. Thank you for reaching out to her. It's been a big help." Katie's eyes softened. She just needed to find her place. It's the same for all of us, really. They fell into a comfortable silence, and James found himself remembering his teenage years, those early days of trying to figure out who he was and what he wanted. Back then, he thought leaving Ashland was the only way to find meaning. But now he could see that a person's roots hold an undeniable value, a stability he had missed during all those years away. As they were leaving, Katie gave him a lingering look. "Welcome back, Jamie," she said warmly. "It's good to have you around again." Life in Ashland continued to unfold, and slowly, the routines of small-town life seemed to settle on both James and Emily. Weeks passed, and while she still missed the city, Emily was beginning to find her rhythm, even spending more time with Sam. The change gave James a sense of relief. He feared she might resent the move forever. Now, as she began connecting with the town and its people, he felt they both were adapting in ways he hadn't expected. One Saturday afternoon, James decided to clear out the attic. Dusty boxes, filled with years of memories, lined the walls. Pulling out a box labeled High School, he chuckled, flipping through old yearbooks, class photos, and mementos from a time when life seemed both thrilling and full of possibility. Just then, he found an envelope at the bottom, buried under a stack of yearbook notes. It was marked Katie, Senior Year. He hesitated, holding the envelope for a moment before opening it. Inside were letters he and Katie had written to each other back in high school, during those final months when they both thought they might be more than friends. The notes were full of hopes and the dreams they'd once shared, with all the earnest intensity of first love. The last letter caught his eye. It was Katie's goodbye note, written just before he'd left for college, and reading it brought back a flood of memories. In her farewell, Katie had written, *, "No matter where life takes us, I'll always have a part of you with me here in Ashland. I hope you find whatever you're looking for, Janie." There was something bittersweet about it now, knowing how life had moved on for both of them. Just then, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Katie, inviting him to join her at a new art exhibit that had just opened downtown. He'd forgotten she was now one of the co-organizers of the local art center, a role she had taken up as her kids got older. Though he was still lost in memories, James quickly replied, accepting her invitation. That evening, James arrived at the gallery, greeted by familiar faces and an atmosphere that brought a warm nostalgia. The walls were filled with works by local artists, many of whom he remembered from school. Katie spotted him from across the room and waved, coming over to greet him with a bright smile. "Glad you could make it," she said, giving him a friendly hug. "We don't get too many big events around here, so we make the most of what we have." As they strolled through the exhibit, Katie introduced him to some of the artists, and they reminisced about high school memories, dances, school plays, and afternoons spent at the cafe downtown. Yet, amid the laughter and nostalgia, James noticed a hint of wistfulness in Katie's smile, a glimpse of a life that hadn't entirely turned out as she planned. Later, they found themselves in a quieter corner of the gallery, and James felt an impulse to ask, "Katie, do you ever think about what might have been? You know, if we'd stayed in touch." She looked at him thoughtfully, then sighed, "Maybe once or twice, but I think we ended up where we were supposed to, right? You built a life out there, a family, a career. I stayed here and, well, I did the same, I suppose. Life just went on." He nodded, though a part of him wasn't entirely convinced. As they continued talking, James noticed that Katie seemed slightly guarded, as if there was something she was holding back. Just as he was about to ask her more, they were interrupted by one of the gallery staff, asking for her help with a guest. She excused herself with a smile, promising they'd catch up again soon. On the drive home, James couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Katie's life than she let on. In the days that followed, they continued texting each other casually, and he noticed she often shared details of her day-to-day life, but avoided deeper, more personal topics. He wanted to ask her more, but he respected her boundaries and decided to wait until she was ready to share. As fall turned to winter, Emily had finally found a comfortable routine. She and Sam spent more time together, and she even joined the school's art club. James was grateful to Katie for being a bridge to help Emily settle in. One evening, over dinner, Emily casually mentioned that Sam's father had passed away years ago. "Oh, I didn't realize Katie was raising him alone," James said, a hint of surprise in his voice. Emily nodded. "Yeah, I guess his dad was really sick for a while. Sam doesn't talk about it much, but he told me his mom is amazing. She held everything together after it happened." The revelation stirred something in James. He had known Katie for years but never heard about her late husband's illness. It made him wonder what else he didn't know about her life. Despite their closeness, he realized how much time and life experience separated them now. One evening, he found himself driving past Katie's house, debating whether to stop by. He didn't want to intrude but felt the need to see her, as if something unsaid had been hanging between them since that night at the gallery. He parked outside and texted her instead. "Are you home? Wanted to drop by if it's not too late." Within minutes, she replied, "Come on in. Just making some tea." When he knocked, Katie opened the door with a welcoming smile, inviting him into the warm, softly lit kitchen. She poured him a cup of tea and motioned for him to sit. They sat across from each other, chatting about small things, the weather, the town, and Emily's progress in school. Finally, James gathered his courage and asked, "Katie, I didn't know about Sam's dad. I had no idea you've been through so much." Katie looked down for a moment, her expression solemn. "It was a tough time," she admitted. "I lost him when Sam was barely 5. He was my best friend, and we thought we had forever together. But life doesn't always give you what you plan for." James reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "I'm sorry, Katie. I wish I'd been here for you. I had no idea." She squeezed his hand briefly, her eyes glistening. "It's okay, Janie. You were living your life, and I had to find a way through it on my own. We're all just trying to make it through in our own ways, you know." They sat there in quiet understanding, the years between them melting away. As the winter deepened, life in Ashland found its usual quiet rhythm. But the connection between James and Katie seemed to take on a new significance. Their conversations grew longer and their silences more comfortable, as if they were beginning to understand each other in ways that only time and experience could teach. Emily had noticed the change too, and though she didn't say much, James could tell she was pleased. Having her father look happy again gave her a sense of comfort she hadn't expected. On a Saturday evening in January, after a heavy snowfall blanketed Ashland, Katie invited James and Emily over for dinner. She lived in a cozy cottage-style home, warm with flickering candles, pine garlands from the holiday season, and the smell of fresh rosemary and garlic in the air. Katie had always been an excellent cook, and this evening was no different. The food was simple but hearty, and James couldn't help but feel that he hadn't been this at peace in years. After dinner, Sam and Emily headed to the den to watch a movie, leaving James and Katie alone in the kitchen. He began to help her with the dishes, though she shooed him away. "Old habits die hard," he laughed, drying the plate she'd already rinsed. She chuckled, shaking her head. "You were always the one to pitch in when it came to chores, weren't you?" James nodded, smiling. "Guess I never quite grew out of it." As the last of the dishes were put away, Katie poured them each a glass of wine. They moved into the living room, where a fire crackled softly in the fireplace. Sitting across from each other, they sipped their wine in the quiet warmth of the room. It was a silence neither of them felt compelled to break. Finally, Katie spoke, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "Do you ever wonder if things happen for a reason?" James considered her question, looking into her eyes. "Sometimes. I'm not always sure what the reason is, though." Katie set her glass down, looking at him thoughtfully. "You left Ashland all those years ago, and now here you are back. In a way, I think part of me always wondered what would happen if you ever returned." He felt the pang of nostalgia mixed with something new, a feeling he hadn't expected. "I think part of me wondered too, even if I didn't realize it." They sat in silence for a moment, as if weighing the unspoken possibilities that hung between them. James wanted to reach out, to close the space between them, but something held him back. He wasn't sure if it was his own lingering doubts or the respect he held for the life Katie had built without him. "Do you remember that last summer before college?" Katie asked, a small smile on her lips. We thought we knew everything. I thought I'd never meet anyone who understood me as well as you did back then." "I remember," he replied, his voice soft. "It feels like a lifetime ago." Katie's smile faded a little, and she looked down at her hands. "It was. We're different people now. I've loved and lost, and you've been through your own struggles too. I just wonder what it would be like if we—" She trailed off, as if hesitant to voice what they were both thinking. He reached across the space between them, gently taking her hand. Her fingers were warm in his, and she looked up at him, surprise mingling with something else in her gaze. "I've thought about it too, Katie. I think about what it would be like if we could start over." She closed her eyes briefly, as if steadying herself, then gave his hand a light squeeze. "Maybe it's not about starting over. Maybe it's about building on what we have now." The vulnerability in her eyes, the way she held his hand as if he might disappear again, it was all James needed. He leaned in, hesitating only a second before their lips met in a soft, tentative kiss. It was like rekindling an old fire, a warmth he hadn't felt in so long that it took him by surprise. As they pulled away, Katie looked at him with a mix of laughter and surprise. "Well, that's one way to catch up." They both laughed, breaking the tension that had been building between them. It was a laughter filled with years of memories, old and new, as if all the missed opportunities were being acknowledged and released in that single, heartfelt moment. After they finished their wine and the evening grew late, James knew it was time to go, even if he didn't entirely want to. They both stood by the door, lingering a moment before saying goodnight. "Thank you for tonight," he said quietly. "For everything." Katie nodded, a gentle smile on her lips. "Good night, James." As he drove home with Emily asleep in the passenger seat, he felt a sense of calm and anticipation, like a new chapter was beginning. He didn't know where things with Katie would lead, but for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. The following days passed in a warm haze of quiet happiness. He and Katie exchanged texts, shared walks around town, and even went on a few casual outings, just the two of them. It felt as though they were rediscovering each other, the connection that had once brought them together now deepening in new, mature ways. They didn't need to rush. They both learned that life often had its own plans. But in a small town like Ashland, nothing stayed private for long. One afternoon, as he grabbed coffee downtown, an old friend approached him with a knowing grin. "Heard you and Katie have been spending time together," he teased, nudging James. "Good to see some sparks fly again." James laughed it off, but part of him knew the town's curiosity would only grow. And while he was ready to explore this new beginning with Katie, he wondered how it might affect Emily and Sam, how they might interpret the changes. Later that evening, he decided to bring it up with Emily. As they sat at the dinner table, he gently mentioned his friendship with Katie. "Em," he started, trying to gauge her reaction, "how would you feel if I started seeing someone? Maybe Katie?" She looked up from her plate, surprised. "You mean, like dating?" He nodded, bracing himself. Emily thought for a moment, her expression shifting from surprise to contemplation. "I think it's nice, Dad. I mean, you deserve to be happy. And Katie's really cool. Sam says she's the best." Relieved, James smiled. "Thanks, kiddo. I just wanted to make sure you were okay with it." As the evening wore on, James felt lighter. Emily's support meant everything to him, and it allowed him to embrace the idea of being with Katie fully. A few days later, he and Katie shared a quiet moment on her porch, bundled in blankets as they watched the snow fall. It was a peaceful silence, the kind that felt natural and grounding. "I never thought life would take us here," she said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Neither did I," he replied, wrapping an arm around her. "But I'm glad it did." They stayed that way for a long time, watching the snowflakes drift down under the streetlight, feeling the weight of the years dissolve around them. For the first time in what felt like forever, James didn't need to chase happiness. It had quietly found him here in Ashland with Katie. Winter in Ashland felt like a blanket of calm over the town, yet for James and Katie, things were beginning to pick up. Their quiet moments on Katie's porch, their long walks through the snow-dusted woods, and the laughter shared over coffee became routine. It was a new kind of life for James, a life he hadn't expected to find again, much less in his hometown. One evening, James and Katie planned a small dinner for some close friends. They wanted to introduce their relationship gently, without too much fanfare. Ashland was a small town, and neither of them had forgotten how quickly rumors spread. Still, James felt grounded and ready, even if he noticed a flicker of hesitation in Katie. That night, the table was full of laughter and stories from high school. Mark, one of James' oldest friends, raised his glass and teased, "Well, I'll admit, I never saw you two ending up together after all these years. But look at you now, Ashland's favorite couple." Everyone laughed, but Katie's smile faltered ever so slightly. She quickly recovered, but James noticed. Later, as they washed dishes together in the kitchen, he took her hand. "Katie, is everything okay?" he asked gently. "You seemed a little, I don't know, distant." Katie dried her hands and leaned against the counter, crossing her arms with a thoughtful expression. "James, I want this. Us, I really do. But I'm just a bit hesitant." "Hesitant about what?" he asked, his tone careful. She looked at him, her expression a mix of apology and apprehension. "There's something I've never told you. Something from years ago, from before Sam was born." James watched her closely, not sure what to expect. "Katie, whatever it is, you can tell me." She took a deep breath and began. "Before Sam, I was married. His father, Will, and I, well, we were happy once. But then, as you know, he got sick, and he was different after that. He became resentful, closed off. He pushed me away, and she paused, choosing her words. I was alone for a long time, even before he passed." James listened, absorbing every word, his heart heavy with understanding. He reached for her hand. "Katie, you went through so much on your own. You didn't deserve that." Katie nodded, but there was more in her eyes. "James, I wanted so badly to escape those memories, to find something that would bring life back to the way it was. And I did things that I'm not proud of. I didn't always make the right choices." "What do you mean?" he asked softly, his fingers tightening around hers. She hesitated, as if considering whether to continue. "After Will died, there was someone I turned to, someone who offered me comfort, though it wasn't love. I wanted to feel something, anything other than grief. It was a mistake and I ended it quickly, but it left me with a lot of regret." James felt her words settle over them, like pieces of a story he hadn't known before. He could feel her vulnerability, her quiet shame over choices she'd made in the depths of grief. He gently touched her cheek, tilting her face to meet his gaze. "Katie, none of us are perfect. We've all done things we regret. But those choices, they don't define who you are." She let out a breath she'd been holding, her expression softening as she looked up at him. "Thank you, James. I didn't realize how much I needed to say it out loud." They held each other in a long, silent embrace, the heaviness of her confession dissolving into a quiet understanding between them. That night, James realized that they were stronger together, that their pasts, imperfect and messy, had somehow brought them here, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed, James noticed a lightness in Katie he hadn't seen before. She seemed more present, her laughter fuller. Emily, too, had warmed to their relationship, often spending time with Sam and bringing up ideas for little family outings. It was as if the threads of their lives were weaving together, creating something new and whole. One afternoon, while Emily and Sam were at a winter arts event at the school, James and Katie decided to clear out some old boxes in her attic. They sifted through dusty albums, childhood toys, and even old records, laughing as they unearthed memories. But as they went through one of the boxes, Katie grew quiet, pulling out an old notebook, worn and dog-eared. "What's that?" James asked, curious. Katie looked down at it, her fingers tracing the faded cover. "It's Will's journal. I haven't read it in years." She opened it to the first page, her expression shifting as she read silently. After a moment, she handed it to James, her face a mixture of sadness and nostalgia. "He wrote this when he was first diagnosed. It's hard to read." James took the journal, glancing over the pages. In Will's handwriting, he saw glimpses of a man wrestling with mortality, fear, and regret. The words spoke of a love he pushed away, of a life he couldn't live fully because of his illness. He felt a pang of empathy for the man who had once been Katie's world, a man who had faced his own darkness and come out fractured. Katie took his hand, her voice low. "I think you wanted me to understand. But back then, I couldn't. I was too hurt, too lost in my own pain." James nodded, understanding more than words could say. In that moment, he felt the weight of both their pasts, but he also felt their resilience, their ability to move forward despite everything. As the evening light faded, they put the journal away, but its impact lingered. They went downstairs, leaving the attic and its memories behind, but something had shifted between them. They had confronted not only Katie's past, but also the lingering shadows that had once kept them apart. And in doing so, they had chosen each other, flaws and all. Days later, as they walked through town, they noticed people greeting them warmly, smiles hinting at an unspoken acknowledgement of their new relationship. They were becoming known as a couple, and it felt right, as though Ashland itself had embraced this new chapter in their lives. One evening, while watching a movie at home with Emily and Sam, James felt a sense of wholeness he hadn't felt in years. The kids laughed, Katie smiled at him from across the room, and for the first time in a long time, James felt like he was truly home. Ashland, with all its memories and secrets, had become his place again. And with Katie by his side, he felt ready to create new memories, to live a life filled not only with love, but with understanding and acceptance. He knew there would be challenges ahead, but for the first time, he felt ready to face them, knowing he had found a love built on truth, on forgiveness, and on the kind of peace only a place like Ashland could offer. As winter slowly gave way to early signs of spring, Ashland felt like it was coming to life again. Small patches of green began to dot the fields, and neighbors were outside more, greeting one another as they prepared their homes for the coming warmth. For James and Katie, life settled into a peaceful rhythm, marked by evenings together, family dinners with Emily and Sam, and the laughter that filled their homes. One Saturday afternoon, James was sitting on the porch with Katie, sipping coffee and looking out at the budding trees in her front yard. It felt almost surreal to him that he found this kind of happiness in Ashland, his childhood home, a place he once thought he'd left behind for good. He glanced over at Katie, who was lost in thought, and took her hand. "You know," he said, "I never imagined I'd be back here, let alone be thinking about staying." Katie turned to him, a soft smile playing at her lips. "Is that so? Does that mean you're actually considering making Ashland your permanent home?" He looked down, smiling as he squeezed her hand. "More than just considering, I think. I can't really imagine leaving now. And to be honest, I don't want to." Her smile grew and she leaned into him. "I'm glad. I think this town has always been home for you, James, even when you didn't realize it." They sat there in comfortable silence, watching the early spring breeze stir the leaves. Just then, the front door creaked open, and Sam and Emily stepped outside, looking at them with matching grins. "Are you guys done being all lovey-dovey yet?" Sam teased, nudging Emily, who laughed and shook her head. Katie chuckled, rolling her eyes. "Oh, please, you two aren't much different yourselves." James laughed, feeling a warmth spread through him. They all headed to the town square, where a small market was setting up for the season's first outdoor gathering. It was something Ashland did every spring, a celebration of sorts, marking the end of winter and the beginning of brighter days. As they walked through the market, Emily and Sam broke off to explore on their own, leaving James and Katie alone to browse. They stopped at various stalls, chatting with friends, tasting fresh-baked bread, and buying small trinkets from local artisans. Everywhere they went, people greeted them with warm smiles, as though welcoming James back into the fabric of the town. One of their stops was at a booth selling handmade pottery. Katie picked up a small vase with a soft blue glaze, her fingers tracing its curves. "What do you think?" she asked, holding it up for James to see. "It's beautiful," he replied, admiring the vase. "Perfect for your kitchen window." Katie grinned, and they purchased it, continuing to wander through the market with it tucked under her arm. It felt almost symbolic, this small, handmade piece of Ashland, something delicate yet enduring like the life they were building together. Later that evening, as they returned home and settled around the table for dinner, James felt a sense of contentment he hadn't known was possible. Emily and Sam were chatting animatedly about their plans for the summer. Sam had invited Emily to a weekend lake trip with some friends, and she was clearly thrilled at the idea. The mention of summer sparked a thought in James' mind, and he glanced at Katie with a twinkle in his eye. "What do you think, Katie? Want to make it official?" She raised an eyebrow, smiling in surprise. "Make what official?" He leaned back, a playful grin spreading across his face. "Moving in together. I mean, it seems like the next step, doesn't it?" Katie looked at him, a mixture of joy and disbelief in her eyes. "Are you serious?" He nodded. "I am. Emily and I don't need much, and honestly, I feel like this is where we belong now. If you're okay with it, I'd love to start building something here together. A real future." Katie's smile was radiant, and she reached across the table to take his hand. "I'd love that, James. I really would." The kids, overhearing, burst into cheers, and Katie and James laughed, feeling a shared warmth and excitement as their little family celebrated this new step. The weeks that followed were filled with plans and preparations, the house slowly transforming to accommodate this new phase of their lives. James moved his belongings from his parents' house, filling Katie's home with the familiar touch of his presence. His books on the shelves, his old records in the living room, and photographs of their shared family now gracing the walls. As the seasons turned, they celebrated milestones together. Emily's high school graduation, family barbecues by the lake, and quiet weekends spent fixing up the garden. The whole town seemed to watch their journey with approval, as if Ashland itself had wrapped them in its embrace. One evening, after a long day of gardening and setting up a little flower bed by the porch, James and Katie sat together, looking out at the stars. Emily and Sam were out with friends, leaving them alone in the quiet, comfortable night. Katie took a deep breath, resting her head on his shoulder. "James, do you ever regret it? Coming back?" He shook his head, wrapping an arm around her. "No, Katie, not for a second. I think this was always where I was meant to be." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "I'm glad. I don't know what I'd do without you now." They sat there together, surrounded by the stillness of the town and the warmth of their shared life. James felt a peace settle over him, as if everything he had ever wanted had somehow found him here, in this quiet, unassuming town. As the night grew late, they stayed wrapped in each other's arms, the weight of their past forgotten, replaced by the promise of the future that lay ahead in Ashland.